All right, so the events of mid-tribulation are the final act, as it were, of this age, and they set in motion the events that bring this age to an end. And that's why that preview was thrown in last week. It's just to connect for us the fact that, hey, you're seeing things here that are just the very end. They're about to set off the last stage of events. All right, that's where we've done what we've done. Now let's get into the next mid-trib chapter, and with it we get a new piece of this puzzle. So the topic changes, chapter 12 now, and we'll read verses 1 through 5. John writes, "A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. And she was with child, and she cried out, being in labor and in pain to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads were 7 diadems, and his tail swept away a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she gave birth he might devour the child. And she gave birth to a son, a male child, who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up to God and to his throne." All right, so the 12th chapter opens with 2 signs. And these 2 signs are working together to tell a single story about something that's happening at the mid-tribulation point. Back to chapter 12. In the opening of chapter 12, we're given 2 signs. And we know they're signs because John says they're signs. All right, so we have to translate the signs into something real. And that begs a question: how do I know what the translation should be? That is, what is the sign a picture of? And that just comes from careful observation of the text, right? From looking at the context. Now, in this case, we have 2 signs. We have a woman with child, and we have a dragon. Okay? The woman represents something. The child represents something, all right? And you have to keep, and the dragon represents something. And you have to keep an understanding of what they represent. You can't just transfer the literal. The woman is not a picture of a woman. The child is not a picture of a child. Okay? They picture something, otherwise they're just literal. They're not signs anymore. All right, so in verse 5, let's start with the child. In verse 5, we're told the child is a son who will rule all the nations with a rod of iron. Now, the reference to ruling with a rod of iron comes from Psalm 2. So we have a child with a rod of iron. Let's look at Psalm 2. If you're laughing at my graphics, it's conditioned for being thrown out of the classroom. Just kidding. Psalm 2:7. That's meant to be funny. "I will surely tell of the decree of the Lord. He said to me, 'You are my son. Today I have begotten you. And ask of me, and I will surely give the nations as your inheritance, and the very ends of the earth as your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron. You shall shatter them like earthenware.'" Now, it was never a surprise to you to learn that the picture of the child is a picture of Messiah, right? So knowing that the child is a picture of Messiah is not the hard part. The point is this: the sign of the child does not represent the baby Jesus. The sign does not represent the baby Jesus, because the baby Jesus never sat on a throne, and the baby Jesus never had a scepter in his hand, and the baby Jesus didn't rule the nations. It's not the baby Jesus, it is the Messiah ruling that is being pictured there. Okay? The Messiah ruling is where the picture stays, or where it lands, because it puts him in a throne at the end and puts him by the right hand of the Father. That's post-infancy, okay? Now, I'm kind of beating that horse a little bit, and I get it, but here's why we're beating that horse. Because as easy as the child was, and as easy as it might be to mistake the child as the infant, if you don't translate the sign and you just stay with the baby is the baby Jesus, where are you going to go next when you look at the woman? Mary. The natural thing to do next is to say, okay, well, the woman must be Mary. And in fact, the Catholic religion portrays Mary in the way of this particular passage. If you've ever seen this picture of Mary, it's a very common iconic view of Mary as the Catholic religion promotes, right? Look at the description: sun, moon, stars. It's from this chapter, reflecting their inaccurate translation of this text. They think the woman represents Mary because they've failed to translate the sign into something. They've just taken it hyper-literally, which would defy John's instructions. He said these are signs, not literal things. All right, so we don't want to make that mistake. So by not making that mistake, we have to do this translation process. The baby is a picture of Christ ruling, The woman, what does she represent? Well, we go back to context again. Notice the woman is clothed with sun, moon under her feet, and has a crown of 12 stars on her head. All right? So, following our rules of interpretation for determining the meaning of symbols, which we've talked about in past weeks, you remember, where's the first place you go looking for an explanation in the Bible for the meaning of those symbols? Where? In the immediate context. In the immediate context, right. We don't find that here. Where's the next place you go? In the book. In other words, the same author. The guy writing that, maybe he said what those meant somewhere else in the same book. We don't find that here either. So that means we go where? And this one's easy. Anywhere else in the Bible, right? And generally speaking, backward in the Bible. And of course, in Revelation, that means everything is before it. So we go back. And in this case, you go all the way back to Genesis. In Genesis 37:5, you find the answer to the interpretation. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Please listen to this dream which I've had. For behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf rose up and also stood erect, and behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." Then his brothers said to him, "Are you actually going to reign over us? Or are you really going to rule over us?" So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Now he had still another dream, and he related it to his brothers and said, "Lo, I have had still another dream, and behold, the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." He related it to his father and to his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you've had? Shall I and your mother and your brothers actually come to bow down before you to the ground?" So Joseph, one of only 2 men in the Bible that received revelation from God through dreams, Daniel being the other, and by the way, in both cases, both Daniel and Joseph, the dreams are always translated in the same text. So in this case, Joseph's dreams are communicating something about his relationship with his family, and I gave you both of his dreams because they build on one another. That is, in the case of the first part of the dream with the sheaves, you get the sense of what the big picture is. God showing Joseph that there would be a day to come in which he would have all the power over that family. Of course, we know that that was fulfilled in his time in Egypt. That's when we see it play out. And then that first part of the dream sets that storyline, which of course no one wanted to hear in his family. And then as it moves to the second dream, the storyline is the same. It's just new symbols to say the same thing twice. And what does it say? In that dream, you have sun, moon, and stars. You've moved from agriculture to celestial bodies, but the sun, moon, and stars now all represent things that correspond to the same idea. But in the way that they now are being used, we see their representation by Jacob's interpretation. In other words, Jacob understood it. And he immediately responded knowing what it meant. And he says, "Will I and your mother and your brothers bow down to you?" Which means that he interpreted the sun, moon, and stars to represent himself as the sun, his wife as the moon, and the stars as the other brothers of Joseph. And this is the only place in the Bible where these three symbols are being used symbolically and then given to us with a translation. And that's a fundamental rule of interpretation. When the Lord wrote the whole book, and he knew when he got to the end of it how it was all going to work together, and he's just asking you to use your noggin and go back through and find those comparisons. That's why they are there. It's not guesswork. There's a reason why there's only one other place to find this, so that you wouldn't be confused if there were two. Right? This is the one. And when you look at the translation, it makes perfect sense. In fact, it fits perfectly in the context of Revelation 12. Because what we now have is a biblical interpretation that says the sun and the moon, and now in 12, we have 12 stars, not 11. That reflects the sons of Israel, or simply put, the nation. The nation of Israel. It was 11 stars in Joseph's dream because he was one of the 12 in the dream. It's 12 stars in Revelation 12 because now we're talking about the whole of the nation, all the tribes. All right, so the woman would represent Israel as a nation, and that, by the way, is reinforced by other scripture that represents the nation of Israel as a female or as a woman. As one simple example, although it's all over the Old Testament, Jeremiah 3:8, "And I saw that for all the adulteries of faithless Israel, I had sent her away and given her a writ of divorce, and yet her treacherous sister Judah did not fear, but she went and was a harlot also." So our interpretation fits perfectly. That is to say, a woman with a sun, moon, and stars represents the nation of Israel, the 12 tribes, of course, coming from Jacob. And as a woman, it's natural for the nation of Israel to be represented that way. And when you connect that sign, that is of the Messiah as a baby in this case, and as the woman as Israel in this case, well, now the picture just builds, because that's a perfect storyline. Israel is the nation that brought forth the Messiah. Now you get why it's not important that it be considered the baby Messiah. It's not about the stage of his life. It's about the mere fact that Israel produced a Messiah. That's the key issue here. Born out of a Jewish family, born out of the family of David, born out of the tribes of Jacob, etc. Okay? So, our first sign in this story is of Israel producing the Messiah. Next, we turn to the third sign of the dragon. And this sign's a little more complex, but following the rules of interpretation gets you to the exact same place, that is, to an answer. And where would you go first to look for a interpretation of the symbols? Back to our rules, in the context, and sure enough, if you go to verse 9, in this passage, you get the answer to what the dragon is. And verse 9, we'll read in a minute, but verse 9 tells us that the dragon is Satan. The serpent of old, it'll say in a minute. So this is, and I'm jumping into that without having read the verse yet, because there's no need to belabor it. It's clear, it's stated for us, we get it, okay? Going further, this dragon has a tail, and that tail sweeps a third of the stars from heaven down to earth. Now, here's where knowing how to use signs really helps. The dragon is a sign. It's not the literal. Satan is not a dragon. Why do you think Satan sometimes is projected or pictured as being red and having a forked tail? It's not because of devil ham. Why does he look like that? This chapter. There's nowhere else he's said to be red except here. But he's not red. This is a sign. He doesn't have a tail. It's a sign, all right? The dragon has a tail because dragons have tails. But the dragon is a sign. It's not the actual picture of what he looks like, okay? So the dragon here has a tail for the effect of the storyline, and this tail sweeps, as it were, the stars. All right, so we have to give more interpretation here. What do stars represent when they're used symbolically? Now, we solved this one early in the book. Angels. And the text later confirms it. When you look further down the text, it talks about the devil and his angels. All right, so we have immediate contextual confirmation of that interpretation. So we have here Satan as the leader of the realm of fallen angels who, as a result of his influence at the time of his fall, swept, or we could say recruited, or deceived, or tempted, or whatever, 1/3 of the angelic realm. This is where you go to find out that 1/3 of the angelic realm follows Satan. All right? And so those demons, which are fallen angels we call demons, represent his army. So in the scene so far, we have two signs. We have one that represents Israel producing the Messiah, another sign that represents the enemy of God, Satan, in his role as the chief accuser, and then Satan as this dragon has some additional details on him, right? We have on this dragon 7 heads with crowns, and we have 10 horns. All right, before we go any deeper into understanding the picture of Satan, can we already begin to see a narrative emerging from the way the two signs are shown to interact in the early verses of the chapter?